Hello, and welcome back to Access Lab. Thank you all for joining us. This afternoon, we've got three sessions on open access coming up. The first session we'll have is called Making Open Access Book Funding Work Fairly, the emergence of library membership funding models for open access monographs. The second session is Open Access in the context of heightened budget pressure. And the third session is Seamless Discovery Services for Accessing Global Open Access Literature. So the first session is a pre-recorded session. It'll be presented by Martin Paul-Eve, who's the Professor of Literature, Technology and Publishing at Birkbeck, University of London, and also part of COPIM, which is the community-led open publication infrastructures for monographs. We'll have a 15-minute Q&A at the end of the three sessions. And as Martin can't join us, Tom will be joining us. So Tom Grady is the Scholarly Publishing Outreach Officer for COPIM and also Opening the Future at Birkbeck, University of London. So three sessions followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Please do drop your questions in as we go into the Q&A box and also use the chat panel.
Hello, and thank you for having me here today. My name is Martin Paul-Eve, and I'm Professor of Literature, Technology and Publishing at Birkbeck at the University of London. And I'm here to talk about ways in which we can make open access book funding work fairly, thinking in particular about the emergence of library membership funding models for open access monographs. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed how important open access and digital access is for the humanities and social scientific disciplines. During the pandemic period, when we saw a massive shutdown of research libraries, it suddenly became incredibly difficult for researchers, especially those in clinically vulnerable categories, to access the trove of knowledge that exists solely in print forms. Furthermore, institutional disparities of access widened the inequalities that already exist in the infrastructural space of research publishing in the humanities, meaning that some institutions had plentiful digital access while others struggled to provide what was needed for their researchers. In this sense, the traditional publishing model appeared somewhat broken to many people over this period. At the same time, we've seen a situation over the past few decades where university presses are seeing a decline in the number of copies of books they've sold, but we're still working in the same way as though we're in an era when 500 copies of a text would be produced and sold. Open access clearly offers increased readership, usage and citation in every form that it delivers, including long-form writing of the monograph, and a set of funder mandates are now creating pressures for us to move towards open access monographs. The problem, though, is that the economics of OA monographs are not straightforward. Book processing charges tend to scale incredibly badly because they have poor distributional characteristics. That is, when you sell a book to 250 libraries, you can spread the cost that the press incurred in producing the book between 250 institutions. When you're looking at putting that all on one author for a book processing charge, suddenly you've concentrated those costs in a way that may not be affordable or sustainable. Again, big institutions may be able to afford £11,000 of book processing charges. Smaller universities probably will not. And it's in this light that we've seen the emergence over the past few years of several types of membership-esque model for open access. So scholar-led born open access presses like Open Book Publishers and Punctum Books have membership schemes where institutions can sign up to support them and ensure their continued operations. At the other end of the spectrum, MIT Press has its direct-to-open model, which is a subscription threshold system where universities subscribe to the front list of books for that year, and if enough institutions subscribe, the titles for that year are all made open access. However, this leaves a large number of small to medium-sized university presses without an obvious model. And that's where the work that I've been conducting on the COPIM project comes in, with the model that we designed called Opening the Future. Opening the Future is a library backlist subscription model for funding open access. And the way it works is a little bit like this. Presses put forward packages of books. So the Central European University Press has 4 packages with 50 books in each. And libraries subscribe to those packages. So there's nothing open access about that. It's just a subscription for the library from the illustrious backlist of the presses that are participating. Where this gets different, though, is that the publisher uses the revenue from that subscription to the backlist to make books in the front list open access. So what we do is we use the revenue from the backlist to make the front list openly accessible, one book at a time. And the economics of this are tailored to be understanding of library pressures in the humanities in particular. So we've been working with Lyrasis and Jisc to produce bandings that are fair to institutions and that range from just £1,000 for the most expensive institutions down to £300 for the smallest. And what do you get for that? So the access to the 50 titles, that subscription is completely DRM free. It's concurrent access, and after 3 years of membership, it's perpetual. So these books are owned by the library after a 3-year period, with no restrictions on the digital reuse. Metadata is provided in MARC, KBART, and counter-compliant statistics are also available. We're working with partners like Project Muse and Liverpool University Press's own platform for OA monographs. Now, what's exciting about this is that if we can reach our target number of libraries and produce 25 new open access titles at the press every year, on top of the 50 titles that libraries are subscribing to, the value for money is incredibly good. We're looking at just £10 per library per book if we reach that threshold. What's also appealing about these types of library membership model is that as more libraries join, the cost of OA books per library comes down. So when presses reach the number of libraries they need to fund their entire front list being open access, and by the way, that's what the Central European University Press is trying to do, is to convert its entire front list of open access research monographs into an open access format using this model. They can either publish more books openly or they can reduce the cost to libraries every year. And that's how we'll achieve scalability among many presses here. So 2 presses are piloting Opening the Future: Liverpool University Press and the Central European University Press. And they're each trying to do something a little bit different. So the first thing to say is that the Central European University Press was a real success story of the pandemic. This press specialises in post-Soviet reconstruction, in Eastern European history and Slavic studies, and has an extremely strong reputation in those spaces. During the March to June 2020 period, so just a very narrow sliver of the early pandemic, they made 279 of their titles openly accessible on Project Muse. These titles were downloaded 350,000 times from 129 countries. And 7 of the top 10 downloads in that period were of titles that were over 10 years old. So there's a real draw to the backlist here. Liverpool University Press, by contrast, is piloting at the series level for Opening the Future. They describe themselves as falling somewhat in the Goldilocks zone, with reference to the fairy tale, believing that they're not a large publisher with a diverse and really profitable portfolio or any significant endowment, but they're not a smaller publisher with library or academic subsidy. They're a medium-ish sized mission-driven publisher with no institutional support and sits squarely in the middle of everything with no safety net. And so they say to us, if this model works here, it should work pretty much anywhere in art, humanities and social sciences. And Liverpool are piloting this on a series in modern languages, which is a subject area that's been under increasing threat in recent years, and that really needs to see sustainable support if research is to continue in this vital area of humanistic inquiry. Now, Opening the Future is an incremental model for open access monographs. Lots of library membership models and other non-book processing charge models for open access books rely on a certain number of institutions participating, and then you either hit your threshold and everything goes OA, or you don't make it and nothing does. We think there's a better way of doing this, which is to work incrementally on the revenue that you get from memberships. So once you reach a certain point, we know how much it costs a press to produce a book. Once that revenue threshold's been met, the next book that is going to be open access at the press will be the next one going through production. And in this way, we have a rolling process where with approximately 10 members, the first book becomes OA. And approximately 20 members, the second book becomes OA. We also get around the challenge of selection that we've seen in some of the other membership-like systems. So one of the worries that libraries have often had is that publishers will simply put their worst books into open access programs. And that's simply not the case here. In the model that we're piloting, as a text comes through the production process and the money is in place to make it open access, we're simply making the next book in line openly accessible. Admittedly, if two books were precisely coming through production at the same time, we might need to make a selection decision. But we're trying to open up the entire front list of research monographs, say at CU Press. And so the selection process is really just a rolling production line of the next book that's ready. And eventually we'll get to the point where all the books are open access. The other point I should say is that there's no double dipping in this model. So if researchers come to the press with a book posting charge because they've got a grant, for example, a press can take that, but that revenue won't count towards the Opening the Future programme and will keep those two streams separate. So libraries will not end up paying for the same book multiple times. Although I should say that all of the open access books produced on this programme also have print copies, and there's no unfavourable treatment as a result of the openly accessible edition. I should also stress that this model is not a read and publish deal. In the journal space, we've seen a lot of talk about transformative agreements and thinking about how we're going to transition a journal model to an openly accessible model without article processing charges. And that's where the read and publish deals have come in, with the idea being that an institutional membership entitles your researchers to publish openly. Instead of that, we're trying to convert entire presses to be open access. So there's none of this question of, can your institution afford a membership? Can your institution afford the book processing charge? If we can sustain presses to just be open access by default, whenever any researcher comes to the press, they'll be able to publish openly. This works well for authors who don't have to find book processing charges, but it also works well for library collections. Instead of building our own collections individually at every library, what we're trying to do is to build one global collection once for everybody. I just want to put in a closing word as to why this is so important. The Directory of Open Access Books versus the Directory of Open Access Journals shows a very different landscape between the spaces. The OA Books market has many smaller players with publications in multiple languages across a broad spectrum of subject areas compared to DOAJ. And the challenge is that people often say, well, can't we just buy the good books, buy the ones that we want? But the problem is that presses can't tell you in advance of them commissioning these books which are going to be the really successful ones, which are going to be the ones that have strong academic merit. What are the future classics? If we knew that in advance, we could simply select and there wouldn't be a problem. But the basic answer is that you can't have the cream without the milk. And so treating presses as infrastructures that need to be sustained so they can try to make these selection calls, but also experiment with the work that they're commissioning rather than just going for popular appeal seems vital for academic inquiry and academic freedom. I mentioned briefly at the beginning the COPIM project, and this is all part of our scaling infrastructure project in this funded initiative of Research England and the Arcadia Trust. So Opening the Future is our outreach to university presses. Open Book Collective is a single platform where libraries can find, assess and sign up to support OA book programs that's coming later in 2022. And TOTE is our open metadata and dissemination program. And we're collaborating with initiatives around the world on this project, so please do have a look at the COPIM website to learn more about what we're doing at copim.ac.uk. And that's where I'll close up. You can find more at openingthefuture.net, or you can send me an email. The thing I'd stress is that without library support for these pilots, they won't work and we won't see the open access future that we want. Really, this is the time when we need to see library investment if we're really going to have an open future. And if open access monographs, the core currency of the humanities and social science disciplines, if those are going to work, this is the time when we need to see these experiments come to fruition. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Martin. So moving on swiftly, we'll have a Q&A at the end of the 3 sessions. So if you have any questions, do pop them into the Q&A. Okay. So yeah, sorry. We'll swap the order a little bit. So we'll have the session now from Peter. So this is a session that's titled "Seamless Discovery Services for Accessing Global Open Access Literature." So Petre Knoth is the head of core and senior research fellow in text and data mining at the Open University.
Okay, I'll just like to make sure that you can see the first slide. Yeah, okay.
We can indeed, yeah.
Excellent, thank you very much for the introduction. So, yes, I am a researcher at the Knowledge Media Institute at the Open University and the head of the core.ac.uk service. This service is a not-for-profit service delivered in cooperation of the Open University with Jisc. What do I want to talk about in this presentation? I will cover the following 4 areas. I will first introduce you to core. I will then explain who uses core and what services it provides. And then I will talk about how core integrated last year with OpenAthens. And I will give a little bit of an outlook of what we want to do in the future to deliver sort of more personalized experiences to the delivery and discovery of open access literature. Okay, let me first talk about what is core. The mission of core is to aggregate all open access research worldwide and deliver unrestricted access to it for all. Core is, at this particular moment in time, the world's largest aggregator of open access research papers. I always try to stress the word papers because we are not aggregating just metadata of papers where basically there are some other competing services. We aggregate both the metadata as well as the full text of the papers. And that gives us the opportunity and ability to do quite more more powerful and more seamless experiences to the users in terms of discovery. I will explain what exactly I mean by discovery in just a little bit. In doing so, we try to enrich scholarly data using state-of-the-art text and data mining techniques. We enable others to develop new tools and use cases on top of the core platform. We support the network of open access repositories and journals with innovative technical solutions. We really try to be best friends with all the data providers that we've got, and we facilitate a scalable and cost-effective route for the delivery of open scholarship. Where does core get the content from? So here you can see in this slide that we've got about 220 million metadata records from across 200 and I think from across and out of these about 28 million are full text hosted within core. This content comes from more than 10,000 data providers and is available in 90 or over 90 languages. Everything that is found in core is free to read, and we've got about nearly 100 million links to free to read papers, deposited in different places around the globe. What is in core? So in core, we've got peer-reviewed research papers, we've got books and open access books and open access book chapters, theses and dissertations, creative arts materials, and grey literature. So it is quite a significant, it is very diverse corpus, basically. And what we've done some studies, for instance, trying to compare what is core, what is in core, and what is, for instance, in other databases, let's say in Crossref, what is registered in Crossref. And we see that there's quite a lot of content that there is not a complete overlap. I would say over, let's say, I will say over 40%, please don't quote me on that, of what is in core is not registered, for instance, in Crossref, which I think is very interesting. In terms of monthly usage, Core is very highly used. A lot of people come to Core as of, this was measured in November last year, and I'm reusing that slide, and we had at that moment 30 million monthly active users. This is basically something from last year as well, a measure, there's a system called Alexa Global Rank. This is something that allows you to sort of compare the usage of websites globally, and you can see, and they measure it in terms of the number of daily visitors on a page over a 3-month period. And you can see that Core was ranking very high. I think high means basically the lower the rank, the more usage the website gets. Basically, number one, rank one is Google in this case. Here you can see a comparison of the usage with other sort of very notable websites in the open access, open science. I probably shouldn't be saying websites. I mean open science and open access infrastructures, which are very highly used. All of these are, I think, notable, very or highly notable services. And you can see that the usage of Core is actually quite significant, I think, in comparison to these other websites. Let me now introduce some of the Core services. Core delivers services in 3 categories. Today, I will particularly focus on the services in the category of content discovery, but I also want to highlight that Core's got services in an area which we call raw data services and services for managing for content management. So in the area of content discovery, we've got 3 services: a service that enables people to discover open access materials that when they are browsing the web, and material that might be behind the paywall, for instance. We've got an open access recommender, and we provide a search system. In the area of raw data services, we basically deliver services, and we work with at the moment over 20 companies and organizations that need raw data access to deliver their own products. And there is a wide variety of companies, and they use it for a wide variety of use cases. These services, these sort of use cases include plagiarism detection. They include, for instance, use cases in pharma companies. They include detection of misinformation, especially misinformation in science, and others. These services contain the API, where basically people can interact with the core data, a data set, and a service we call FastSync. And finally, we've got the last group of services is something we call managing content. And these are services which are targeted for higher educational institutions and for our data providers. It helps these data providers to effectively manage the collections, manage the quality of the metadata that they deliver. It helps them also to comply with open access policies, and it helps them to make sure that basically the way they expose the content to aggregators is done in an interoperable fashion, and that it follows the best sort of guidelines and processes. Let me now talk very quickly about each one of them. So Core Search is basically a service which a lot of people know. We have recently released a new version of Core Search. This is a service basically which anyone can find on our website. It's very straightforward, and one of the key principles that we use in the Core Search is that what you find is actually what you can access. So, there are no nasty surprises of you effectively coming to discovering some content which then you cannot actually download. So everything is completely free, and you can get the PDF for anything, which I believe is at the moment what the users of Core really like, and often corresponds to the motivation of why they come there. Core Search, and this is the new Core Search, which was just released. So if you come to the Core website, this is what you will be able to see. We then have a system called Core Recommender. This is a recommender plugin that is available both in Core but also in over 400 websites. We have basically this integrated in different places, and here is an example of how this is integrated, for instance, on a very well-known repository called archive.org. So if you go to archive.org, for any research paper which you find there, you will be able to find other related papers from across the global network of repositories. So for one of the things that we deliver effectively to every data provider out of these 10,000 data providers that we've got is basically a service that their content gets aggregated by us, and it can get recommended from across this network of global repositories. Then we've got a service called Core Discovery. This can be installed in 2 ways. One of these ways is a Google Chrome plugin, where basically you can install it from the Google Chrome market. And this is basically a service that as you browse the web, if you come across a particular research paper that on a publisher's website, which might be behind the paywall, we look up whether this same material is available from across the global network of open access repositories, and if so, we will let you know. And if not, if it's not available there, then we recommend you at least some highly related papers from across that network. We also integrate this or deliver this service as an integration into open access repositories. Open access repositories effectively and sadly, most of the pages in open access repositories are sort of metadata only pages. And therefore, when a repository installs this plugin that we deliver, and when we discover that the content which they are advertising is, for instance, available with its full text from another repository, then we make it possible for the user, even if they don't have this plugin, this Chrome plugin installed, we make it possible for them to discover the full text more easily. So what I wanted to illustrate here, that effectively Core has got 3 different discovery services. By discovery, we don't necessarily mean only search, we mean also recommendations, and we mean also sort of discovery of open access content, making it faster for the user to come and be able to interact with the material that they are intending to access. And I want to mention the Core API. We have a new Core API. This is one of the services for the raw data access. And the new API webinar was presented in January. And I encourage anyone who is interested in sort of building new applications on top of all research papers across the world to sort of come and try the API. I think it's something which is becoming highly popular. We've got thousands of users who really try to interact with this, and we see lots of applications delivered on top of this content. And we know that we will not be able to deliver everything, so we sort of are giving the data and the service away so that people can come up with new use cases and utilize this service in perhaps unexpected way. The data set is very similar to the API, but you download all the data. You need to prepare yourself for the fact that it's about 3 terabytes of textual information in plain text. So it's an enormous database. It's several times bigger the text than, for instance, Wikipedia. That just really gives you the idea of how much knowledge is embedded in research, in open access research papers across the world. Okay, as I'm coming towards the end of my talk, I want to focus on something that we delivered in cooperation with OpenAthens. Everything that I said so far talks about or considers Core as a non-personalized service for discovering research literature. In 2021, we cooperated with OpenAthens, and we delivered a system that through which Core integrates into the interfaces of OpenAthens. But we are thinking at the moment, and this is not something that has been implemented yet, that we would very much like to further expand on this and build something more. And this is something that I have personally in mind. I would like basically all our users to be able to authenticate using the OpenAthens protocol. and to effectively be able to create, to be able to access core through the login details, through the same username and password that their university gives them already. And by doing so, after doing so, we would be able to not only recommend, let's say, papers which are just related to users, but we would be able to do, which are related, to other papers. We would be able to actually give them recommendations on what is related specifically to their own interests. And I think this is really interesting. And this experience can be then integrated either into OpenAthens or it can be part of the core experience. So here, for instance, you can see that we would be able to, people would be not only able to search for content, but they would be able to, for instance, say, I'm interested in researching or marketing, and then they would be able to basically see research papers that are related to, let's say, their latest interests. They would also be able to have their own library of things that they are interested in. This is an example of the search. This is an example of the user effectively tagging just one of those topics of interests and then seeing those papers that are relevant in this area. Here you can see the thing that I talked about, which is the personalized recommender, which can recommend, for instance, because you previously read a specific article or because latest papers you might be interested in are based on the previous activities of this very same user. What I'm really interested in is basically whether this is of interest to people. We want to be testing this with our users, and we want to be we will be evaluating whether we can find funding basically and resources to build this new additional personalized experience. So in summary, Core is a very highly used open access content discovery service. By content discovery, I don't mean only search. I mean search, discovery, finding open access content and making it easier for people to access content. It is a comprehensive, free, seamless access. It provides comprehensive, free, seamless access to open access content. Core is a not-for-profit service. So, it's something that can be integrated and reused very much from across the research network. It is an enabling service. I think in most of all, it is a service that enables other people to build new applications on top of the research content. And if you have any questions for me, I will be very interested in, or feedback from me, I would be very interested to know whether the idea or what you might think about the idea of the integration with OpenAthens. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter, and thanks for stepping up at short notice. So over to you, Anna. Let me share my screen. I have the slides available, and
thank you. Wow, it works. So second slide, please. I've introduced myself, I've managed to do that. So a bit about Jisc licensing. We work on behalf of all universities, research institutions and further education colleges in the UK. And each year we negotiate around 300 agreements. And in 2020, we saved our members around 8 million in real money. So that's not cost avoidance via our open access negotiations. And our agreements are taken up by around 90% of our higher and further education members. Next slide, please. So it's always good to start on a slide of challenges, isn't it? But here are some of the more acute challenges we've observed over the last few years, and one which we're working with our strategic groups to try and really address through our negotiations. So we've seen that the share of Diamond journal articles, so that's those journals that are community-based and collectively funded, is decreasing. We're also seeing a reduction in the diversity of where researchers are publishing. 5 publishers accounted for 58% of fee-based OA in 2020 versus 44% in 2015. And we're also seeing that dominance of fee-based OA has potentially quite exclusionary potential, particularly for those researchers based in low and middle income countries. We've also seen heightened corporate consolidation, including the acquisition of born open access publishers, and high increases in article processing charges and announcements of APCs that are higher than $10,000 an article. So there's a risk that greater accessibility in open access might come at a cost of affordability and equity, not only globally, but to our members across in UK institutions as well. So next slide, please, Rob. So the aim of our publisher negotiations is to open up publishing opportunities wherever the author is based, whatever their funding situation, whichever venue they choose to publish in. And although a lot of the read and publish transitional agreements have hit the headlines, we want to emphasise the importance of looking beyond those large read and publish agreements, because they're just one mechanism that our members want to achieve full and immediate open access. But at the same time, funds are very limited, and our agreements must return the best value for public money, which also means doing all we can to reduce those administrative barriers as well, and those admin costs that aren't as visible perhaps. So next slide, please, Rob. So to try and tackle this, our negotiations, which are driven by our strategic groups, have been to use a kind of twin track. The first track has really been centred on trying to challenge those dominant publishers to deliver greater value, but in parallel make it easier for smaller publishers and those new entrants and models to be sustainable. On the first track, we're looking for agreements that deliver that full and immediate transition to open access using existing and wherever possible reduced subscription spend. And the main vehicle to date for doing that has been transitional agreements mentioned earlier. And our second strand is really comprised of additional support for small, medium and mission-driven publishers, as well as fully open access agreements launching community-based models and open monographs. Next slide, please. So a bit on the benefits of transitional agreements. So transitional agreements in a nutshell utilise existing spend that used to be spent on paywalled access to content, and that's used to fund open access publishing. So recently our agreements have provided frictionless immediate open access publishing, in most cases to the publisher's full portfolio. They've reduced existing subscription expenditure, including the removal of all APC spend, and that's in an increasing number of cases. They guarantee and automate funder requirements. So the idea there is that you remove an author having to think about complying with their funders policy. It just happens, and we do a lot of work behind the scenes to hopefully make that happen for authors. And things like the application of CC BY terms, and those agreements have enhanced post-cancellation rights. And what's great to see is that they've increased participation. So 132 subscribers published at least one OA article via the Wiley Read and Publish agreement. Next slide, please. So we are now on track for 80% of all UK research to be covered by a Jisc negotiated agreement, and we've got some announcements coming up in the next few days around that. And we're looking that grey section right at the end. That's where our area of focus has been. So next slide again, please, Rob. So the sector's requirements for its open access agreements were developed with UK higher education institutions. We undertake our negotiations very much for and with the community, and those groups are responsible for reviewing the sector's requirements and to review them annually, and to reflect their experiencing and managing and implementing, but also paying for these agreements. So we've recently just reviewed our requirements for transitional journals. So we've got requirements for transitional agreements, transitional journals, and fully open access agreements as well. So next slide, please. So UK institutions are kind of agnostic as to the models they prefer, but they do support a number of strategies to make UK research output open access. So I've categorised the models on the left by being kind of transitional, i.e. they repurpose existing subscription spend, as well as highlight some of the things we're doing around those other strands. So I'm not going to go into those models too much, but we now have requirements around each of those types of agreements agreed by the sector, so that it should be really clear for publishers or new entrants what would a good agreement look like for all of these types of models. And we're very keen, as I'll talk about in a second, to work with smaller society publishers to help broker agreements that work for them and their communities. So next slide, please, Rob. So our approach over the last 2 years has been to work very closely with small society and mission-driven publishers. We've negotiated 25 new agreements. We've got a lot more in the pipeline. We know that brokering a single agreement with Jisc saves institutions, but also publishers time and money, and there's efficiency gains to be had there as well. So we're prioritising our discussions with smaller society publishers by the largest proportion of funded articles. And we work with them very closely to consult very carefully with institutions on suitable models, to look at publication levels, to look at expenditure, and to set up pilots consulting with institutions. So we really want to be driven by what works for the publisher, what works for institution, and also what works for their communities as well. In addition, we've recently launched our open access community framework. For the first year, that's focused on diamond array publishers, and we're looking to expand that out. And the idea behind that is to really start to build in those support mechanisms so that institutions can continue to contribute, and that those organisations can continue to be sustainable. Right, next slide, please, Rob. So it's really important to note that these agreements really aren't the end point, and we've got our transitional agreements oversight group to define and design what the future of these agreements will look like. So what does post-transition look like, and to work out what is, well, to define what exactly do we mean when we're talking about transparency in terms of fees, but also transparency in terms of the how quickly we want to transition to open access, and what does a good agreement look like. So next slide. So lastly, I want to touch upon some of the things that we're looking at doing. So looking beyond the transition. We know that the negotiations that we're undertaking at the moment are precedent setting, and that we do want to keep those twin tracks alive and to really demonstrate the best value for money in terms of publishing services from all our agreements, but also to set up mechanisms that work for smaller society publishers. We want to break the assumption that current levels of spend and large upfront payments are the baseline for these, particularly for the kind of larger big deals. And we also want to do what we can really to challenge, the publishers' segmentation, and to talk more about what we mean by publishing services and what does value look like. And we're working quite closely, as I said, to look at transparency and to define what we mean by transparent. And we're also rebalancing ourselves. So we want to implement cost allocation in the next few years. So working very closely with institutions to try and move away from models that are based on historic print spend. So thank you. That was a bit of a canter through the slides, but hopefully there's still time for questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Fantastic. Okay. So we've got so we have Anna, we have Peter, and we also have Tom Grady, who's standing in for Martin as well, who will joining us for the Q&A. So it looks like we've had a few coming in. So I think the first question is for you, Peter. So it says, core, if you went via the authentication route, would you still offer a non-authenticated search option?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the idea is basically that you know, the non-authenticated search option is incredibly important. People really want it, and the authenticated one would be for a smaller group of people, a set of people who desire more personalized experiences, and they would obviously at any given point be able to log out basically and use the non-personalized one. We learned from users that many users don't want to be tracked. They don't want the systems to know effectively what they are searching for and so on. And you know, from that perspective, being able to stay sort of anonymous in your searches is, I think, really important.
Fantastic. So I can see, yeah, one other question for you, Peter, as well. So could EDS, so EBSCO Discovery Service, tap into a core API to support patron discovery via our default discovery tool, via the default discovery tool they're already likely to be using?
I'm really sorry, I don't understand the question. Can you please?
So I think the crux of the question is, could EBSCO Discovery Service make use of the core API?
Ah, okay, EBSCO. Okay, so I misunderstood. Absolutely. So in fact, I am at the moment in conversations with EBSCO, and so this is not something that is completely new to me. Core is actually, there are other discovery services we've been talking to, for instance, ProQuest as well, where they sort of expressed interest, but it's now effectively it's a question of whether we will find an organizational agreement between these services. We're very interested in this. If the person who mentioned this would be happy to drop me an email about, you know, I'm sort of particularly interested whether this is something that they would desire, then I would really appreciate this, because I think sort of evidence of need is something that I'm really collecting here at this point in time.
Fantastic. Okay, so I have one question, and I think I'll come to each of you separately for this as well. So it's a question for everyone on the panel. Do you think there will be a time when transition to open access is finished or close to be finished, close to finishing? And if yes, what kind of timescale do we think that's happening in? So Tom, do you want to start?
Thank you. Well, this is definitely a question that should go to Martin rather than his standard. So apologies, first of all, that Martin couldn't make it today. I mean, speaking personally, we've talked a lot about the model that Martin presented today. We've talked to libraries a lot about when will the backlist run out. If you sort of subscribe to a backlist in order to kind of pay for new open access books, at some point that backlist is going to run out. And Martin often answers this by saying, you know, some of the publishers we're talking to, they've got enough backlists to go on like this for 40 years. And if we're still having this conversation in 40 years, then we've got a much bigger problem. And so that's a kind of a roundabout way of saying, I think there probably is some kind of end point where you know, the majority of new scholarship is openly available for those authors that want it and for those funders that want it. But I'm speaking very much from a monograph perspective there. I think the journal world is very different again, and perhaps that's a good point at which for me to hand over to Anna, who seems to know a lot more about journals than I do.
Thanks, Tom. I think the transition needs to be kind of put in a global context, and I'll also try and answer two questions in one. So Jisc licensing and the kind of Jisc Collections Consortium is probably one of the largest library consortia in the world, and we work really closely with our equivalents overseas to share our experiences in negotiating these agreements, and to kind of encourage those, or to work through strategies to help other consortia or research intensive institutions to strike these agreements, to start off on their kind of open access journey, really. But there is, as with monographs, there's back files. There's also very large research intensive countries and institutions that aren't quite there yet. So I think to keep myself sane and the team sane, I try and focus in on what we in the UK can usefully do in partnership with those that are ready to go there. So for more information, please see initiatives like OA 2020, but it has to happen globally, and we work really hard to kind of share our experiences with other consortia and institutions as well. So I don't know how I did there, but
I just wanted to add that there is a discussion in the community about the existence of something that would be a tipping point at which universities could effectively give up the need to subscribe to publishers. We don't know when that tipping point is going to happen. I think it's clear that it exists, and it would be effectively it will happen at the point when institution will feel that the subscription literature is no longer that important, and there are lots of alternatives for that subscription literature in the open access domain. I think several things need to happen for us to get there, and this will not be an inclusive list, but we really need to see that nearly 100% of the literature, of the recent literature, is being made available as open access. I think that's really clear. And additionally, there is a delay, I think, to it, because at some point you need to people still, it's not like if there is a paper published in 2022, it will be probably needed for the next 10 years. So we cannot sort of remove that content. And there are probably other important things that Anna might be able to comment on better than me.
And it was just to add that I think there'll still be a need to support, but ideally that money should be able to move a bit easier than it currently is at the moment, and to support hopefully a broader range of initiatives, and to not be locked into so many kind of subscription only contracts. I think that's our main concern, and institutions' main concerns, really, that what you're paying to access and publish, or a range of services, hopefully would look very different very, very soon, and that's what we're aiming to do as well. Thanks.
Fantastic. So I think we've got time for 2 other questions. So back to you, Peter. Does CORE welcome, as a data provider, repositories that combine medical and related grey literature?
Absolutely. We invite any data providers who effectively deliver the content as open access, or at least free to read. That's the absolute minimum. And the data providers need to expose the content via a machine readable interface. It's nothing really complicated. They need to support something which is called OAI-PMH, or another protocol which we support.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. And then, just as we're sort of closing out, there was one comment here saying that there's lots of talks about books and journals, related to open access. Are there other formats that could or should be covered? Video, data, for example. Anybody have a view on that?
I think open educational resources is probably a whole other topic for a completely new session, but it's something that Jisc have been heavily involved in for many, many years. But it's a really good point, and I think we shouldn't be too kind of too close-minded when we think about what we mean by open research or open teaching and learning.
May I just follow very quickly on your excellent point, Anna? I am at the moment working very closely with Jisc on a project which actually tries to sort of create a prototype of something like an aggregator of open educational resources for the UK. And I think it's really striking to see that this community, the research community, is actually very much ahead compared to the further education community, which basically talks about open educational resources, where effectively we have built a lot of infrastructure, in terms of the repositories and open access and so on. And we know that we would like to be a lot further, for instance, in research. But compared to the, I would say, training infrastructure, we are a lot ahead in research at the moment. So the training infrastructure has a lot of catching up to do.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we've come to time now, and I think there's a couple of other questions that are in the chat which we can certainly get back to on if we haven't covered your questions. So yeah, just left to thank all the speakers. So thank you for Martin, thank you for Tom for joining us for the Q&A. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for stepping in and doing your session a bit earlier, Peter, as well. And we're going on to another sort of 10-minute break now, and we'll be back at 10 to the hour.